History hides its darkest secrets behind the thickest layers of gold. When we look at ancient Egypt, we see the breathtaking monuments of queens like Nefertiti, Hatshepsut, and Cleopatra. We assume that to wear the vulture crown was to be the most powerful, liberated woman in the ancient world. But behind the high mud brick walls of the royal palace, life as a great royal wife was a psychological minefield. From the terrors of state-enforced incest to the blood-soaked harem conspiracies, being an Egyptian empress was often a beautiful death sentence. Before we unlock the gates to the pharaoh's private chambers, take a second to hit that like button. It helps the algorithm bring more deep dive history to your feed. And because ancient history connects all of us, drop a comment below letting me know what part of the world you are watching from tonight. Let's uncover the brutal reality of the Golden Cage. Chapter 1. The Palace as a Golden Prison. Let us look first at the physical reality of her daily life. For the Egyptian empress, the world was remarkably small, static, and deeply isolated. Her life was bounded entirely by the walls of the IP at the House of the Secluded, commonly known as the Royal Harem. These were not just single buildings, they were massive, self-contained palace cities, hidden away in royal capitals like Memphis, Malkata, or Akhetaten. Inside these sprawling complexes, the Empress had everything she could ever physically need. Private courtyards shaded by date palms, specialized workshops for weaving the finest linen, and lush gardens irrigated by private canals fed by the Nile. But she was a prisoner of her own purity. The Empress lived in absolute isolation from ordinary people. She could not walk through a crowded marketplace, feel the spray of the river on a public ferry, or watch the trade boats arrive at the docks from Babylon. Every single movement she made was governed by a rigid, unyielding calendar of religious protocols and court etiquette. Scribes tracked her every meeting. High priests dictated who could speak to her, what words could be used in her presence, and when she was permitted to cross an archway. She was an icon to be kept pure, locked away from the chaotic, dusty reality of the outside world. Chapter 2. The Mask of the Goddess. Consider the sheer physical exhaustion of simply getting ready each morning. The Empress's body itself was a piece of state theater, and the daily preparation was a grueling, hours-long process. An ancient Egyptian cosmetic palette used for grinding protective pigments. Long before she attended a temple ritual, an army of specialized servants descended upon her quarters. First came the cleansing, scrubbing her skin with abrasive natron salts and ash paste to strip away dead skin and the natural scent of humanity, followed by massages with thick goose-foot oils scented with cedar and cinnamon. Next came the hair. To prevent lice and maintain absolute cleanliness in the brutal Egyptian heat, royal women frequently shaved their heads entirely with bronze razors. Her natural hair was replaced with a massive, suffocatingly heavy wig made of human hair and sheep's wool, coated in a cone of scented animal fat and beeswax that melted slowly over her scalp over the course of the day to keep her smelling fresh. Then came the cosmetics. Her eyes were painted heavily with green malachite paste on the lids and thick bands of black coal around the rims. This wasn't just for beauty. The lead and copper bases of these paints acted as a crucial medical barrier against the blinding glare of the desert sun and the swarms of FLIs carrying eye infections. Finally, she was draped in pounds of heavy jewelry, wide beaded collar pieces of turquoise, carnelian, and solid gold that pressed down painfully on her collarbones, and towering headdresses shaped like the wings of a vulture or double feathers that required her to keep her neck perfectly stiff and rigid. By the time she stepped into the public eye, she was no longer a person. She was a living statue, trapped inside a hot, heavy costume, forced to project serene, unsmiling perfection while her muscles ached underneath the gold. Chapter 3: The Reality of the Ancient World. To understand the scale of her anxiety, we must look at the true state of life in the Bronze and Iron Ages. Even with all the wealth of the Nile, life in ancient Egypt was fragile. Modern CT scans and DNA analysis of royal mummies reveal a harsh truth. The ancient world was plagued by diseases that gold could not cure. The Nile, while life-giving, was a breeding ground for parasites. Waterborne vector diseases like malaria and schistosomiasis were rampant, infecting peasants and royalty alike. Archaeologists analyzing the teeth of ancient skeletons have found that almost every single Egyptian, including the pharaohs and their queens, suffered from severe, agonizing dental attrition. Because the Egyptians ground their emmer wheat into flour using sandstone blocks, fine quartz sand and stone dust constantly leaked into their bread. Every bite of food wore down their tooth enamel, exposing the raw nerves beneath, leading to chronic abscesses, massive gum infections, and severe, unmanageable pain that lasted a lifetime. Even in a palace of gold, the basic physical reality of eating was a source of constant discomfort. Chapter 4: The Inbreeding Trap. To understand the deepest tragedy of the Empress, we must look at her marriage. While ordinary Egyptian citizens married outside their families and practiced monogamy, the royal court operated under a completely different, deeply destructive set of rules. To keep the royal bloodline divinely pure, mirroring the primal gods Osiris and Isis, and to ensure that no outside noble family could ever claim a drop of royal blood to challenge the throne, the Empress was trapped in an endogamous cycle. She was regularly forced to marry within her immediate family. She was wedded to her own biological brother, her half-brother, or in many well-documented historical cases, her own father once her mother passed away. Generation after generation of this intense inbreeding took a devastating physical and psychological toll. The royal family suffered from severe genetic defects, physical frailties, and remarkably high rates of miscarriage and stillbirth. Historical analysis of later royal lines, such as the Tutankhamun lineage, shows severe physical issues like clubbed feet, cleft palates, and degenerative bone necrosis directly resulting from this practice. The very rule meant to protect her family's divine right to rule was the exact thing that caused immense personal grief, genetic degradation, and the silent agony of a failing body. Chapter 5: The Psychological Warfare of the Harem. Even if she managed to survive the physical toll of her lineage, her domestic life was a battlefield. Her husband did not belong to her. He belonged to the state, and his palace was dominated by the institution of the royal harem. While there was only ever one great royal wife who held the supreme religious titles, the palace was packed with hundreds of secondary wives, daughters of local governors, and foreign princesses brought in to seal diplomatic treaties. The Empress did not live in a private home. She lived at the apex of a multi-tiered, highly volatile compound filled with competitive rivals. This structure created a permanent environment of low-grade panic and psychological warfare. If her children fell victim to the rampant infant mortality rates of the ancient world, her political leverage dropped to zero. A secondary wife from the lower tiers of the harem could easily elevate her own son to become the next pharaoh, pushing the Empress into immediate irrelevance and poverty. Because of this, the inner palace was a silent, treacherous space where dozens of women were actively rooting for the Empress's children to fail so their own lineage could advance. History shows us that these rivalries often turned lethal, with secondary wives organizing underground palace coups and using untraceable poisons to clear the path to the throne. As Empress, you could never lower your guard. Every meal brought to your table could contain a tasteless poison, and every polite bow from a rival courtier could be the mask of an assassin. Chapter 6: The Physical Agony of Childbirth. Because of the intense dynastic pressure to keep the family line alive, the Empress's primary, unyielding duty was to be in a factory, and the physical harm she had to endure to achieve this was terrifying, especially in a world where the average human life expectancy was only about 30 years. In ancient Egypt, there were no pain-relieving medications, no understanding of sterile environments, and no knowledge of bacterial infections. When it came time to deliver the crucial heir, the Empress did not lie in a soft bed. She was taken to a special pavilion and placed on a birth chair, or forced to squat upright on two large, decorative mud bricks known as birthing bricks. She had to push against gravity for hours, completely exposed, while priests chanted spells and midwives waved ivory batons and bronze knives to scare off the demon Apopis. If the delivery stalled or the baby was breech, modern surgical intervention did not exist. Midwives had to use rough physical force, unsterilized bronze hooks, and sharp flint blades to manually extract the infant. If the Empress survived the sheer physical trauma and internal tearing of the delivery, she faced an even deadlier enemy: postpartum infections. Without antibiotics, a minor tear contaminated by the unsanitary environment led to puerperal fever raging, agonizing internal infection that caused severe abdominal swelling, delirium, and a painful death within days. The path to securing the throne was paved with literal physical mutilation. Chapter 7: The CEO of the Estates. When she wasn't navigating the dangerous politics of the court, the Empress was burdened with a crushing administrative workload. She was not a pampered ornament. She was the active chief executive officer of a massive economic network. The institution of the harem and her royal court required an astronomical amount of wealth to run, and the state treasury did not pay for it directly. Instead, the Empress was personally granted vast territories of agricultural land across Upper and Lower Egypt, along with entire villages of peasants, fishermen, and cattle herdsmen who worked them. She was legally responsible for managing these vast estates. From her palace chambers, she had to direct a small army of her own personal scribes, bailiffs, and tax collectors. She had to oversee the grain stores, audit the records of the flax harvests, and ensure the textile workshops under her command turned a massive profit. If the Nile floods were poor and the harvest failed, the financial crisis fell squarely on her shoulders. A weak harvest meant she could no longer pay her hundreds of attendants or maintain her household, stripping her of the resources necessary to keep her political status and influence alive in the central court. Chapter 8: The Terror of the Power Vacuum. But the most terrifying time to be an empress was when the music stopped, when the pharaoh died. In the Egyptian worldview, the king was the absolute linchpin holding the universe together. He was the force that kept chaos at bay and maintained cosmic order. The moment a pharaoh drew his last breath, the entire empire fell into a state of profound existential panic. The universe was considered broken, and the threat of rebellion loomed. For the widowed empress, this transition period, the interregnum, was a walk across a tightrope over an abyss. If her son was fully grown and ready to take the throne, she transitioned into the highly respected, safe role of the Queen Mother. But if her son was still a small child, or if she had only given birth to daughters, she was suddenly left utterly defenseless. Ambitious viziers and power-hungry generals would immediately move to exploit the situation. The Empress might find herself forced into a humiliating marriage with a much older usurper or a common official simply to give his stolen crown a thin veneer of religious legitimacy. If she was no longer useful, she might be quietly locked away in the dark, subterranean supply chambers beneath the palace, left to starve to death and be forgotten by the court. Chapter 9. The ghostly retirement and the tomb prison. Even if an empress successfully survived the cutthroat politics of the harem, outlived her husband, and successfully placed her son on the throne, her final years held a quiet, melancholy horror. In Egypt, preparation for death was a lifelong obsession. From the moment she became empress, a large portion of her daily thoughts and economic resources didn't go toward living, they went toward her grave. She had to constantly oversee the construction of her own tomb in the Valley of the Queens. As she aged, she watched her own sarcophagus being carved. She inspected the jars that would eventually hold her lungs, her liver, and her stomach. And when her time finally came, her body was subjected to the brutal, invasive process of mummification, stripped, salted with natron for 40 days, dried into a hollow shell, and tightly bound in hundreds of yards of resin-soaked linen. Her final resting place was a pitch-black stone vault, sealed behind tons of rock, designed never to see the light of the sun or hear a human voice again. The isolation she endured in her golden palace was simply a dress rehearsal for the eternal, silent isolation of her tomb. Chapter 10. The Poisoned Mirror. To maintain the status of a living icon, the Empress had to look flawless, but the ancient cosmetics designed to elevate her to goddess status were slowly, silently destroying her mind and body from the inside out. Every single day, the Empress was heavily painted with kohl and madema, the famous thick, black and green eyeliners of Egypt. While priests claimed these pastes invoked the protective eye of the sky called Horus, the reality was a toxic trap. The makeup was formulated from raucolina and malachite, heavy ores of lead sulfide and oxidized copper. As the years passed, these heavy metals seeped continuously through her thin facial skin and into her bloodstream. The symptoms of chronic lead poisoning would take hold slowly, masked as simple exhaustion or the strain of royal life. She would experience persistent, agonizing abdominal cramps, chronic insomnia, and an unexplainable, creeping irritability. The very chemicals meant to make her beautiful eventually caused her joints to ache, her kidneys to slowly fail, and her mind to suffer from bouts of paranoia and mental fog. Tragic irony where the daily ritual of divine duty was actually a slow, lifelong dose of poison. Chapter 11. The Terrors of the Kahun Papyrus. When the Empress fell ill or faced a difficult pregnancy, she was at the mercy of the Sunu, the royal physicians whose treatments were guided by texts like the Kahun Gynecological Papyrus. In the ancient Egyptian medical mind, the womb was viewed as an independent, wandering entity within the female body. If an empress complained of a headache, neck pain, or blurred vision, the physicians did not look to the nervous system. They believed her uterus had become dislodged and was actively migrating upward, compressing her upper organs. To lure the womb back down into its proper anatomical position, the Empress was subjected to deeply invasive, agonizing, and humiliating treatments. She would be forced to sit over smoking pits for aromatic fumigations, breathing in the acrid smoke of burning incense, oil, and organic resins. If a more drastic measure was deemed necessary to ward off evil spirits or reset her fertility, the royal physicians would apply topical poultices or insert pastures made from sour milk, raw honey, and even dried crocodile dung directly into her body cavities. Instead of offering comfort, ancient medicine transformed any female illness into a painful, unsanitary trial of endurance, leaving the Empress entirely defenseless against infection. Chapter 12. The Burden of Dynastic Erasure. Finally, we must look at the psychological terror of complete systemic fragility. An Empress's entire existence, her safety, and her memory after death relied on a concept called damnatio memoriae, the total erasure of a soul. If an empress found herself on the wrong side of a dynastic shift, her punishment wasn't just physical exile, it was cosmic annihilation. The Egyptians believed that a soul could only live forever in the field of reeds if its name was spoken and its image preserved on earth. If a rival faction took the throne, an army of stonemasons would be sent into the temples and tombs with chisels and mallets. They would systematically hack away the Empress's face from every wall painting, carve her cartouche out of the granite pillars, and smash her limestone statues into unrecognizable dust. Her name would be struck from the official king lists and temple registries, effectively rendering her a non-person. She lived her life under the terrifying realization that no matter how much gold she accumulated, how many monuments she built, or how flawlessly she served the gods, a single political misstep by her or her children could result in her being completely wiped from human memory, condemning her spirit to wander blind, nameless, and entirely forgotten in the eternal dark. Chapter 11. The Golden Cage of Royal Protocol. Every single second of the Empress's day was dictated by a rigid, unyielding court etiquette known as the balance of the palace. She was never permitted to simply exist. She was a performer in a lifelong, highly choreographed ritual. From the moment she opened her eyes in the morning, her private spaces were flooded with specialized courtiers. There were servants whose entire life's purpose was to hold her left shoe, priests whose sole job was to chant protective spells over her morning wash basin, and fan bearers who stood perfectly still for hours, moving only their wrists to keep the stagnant air circulating around her head. This meant the Empress had absolute zero privacy. She could not walk into her private gardens alone, have an unguarded conversation with a friend, or even weep in solitude over a lost child or a cruel husband. Every sigh she exhaled was recorded by court scribes. Every shift in her facial expression was analyzed by palace factions looking for a sign of weakness. The crushing weight of constant observation created a state of permanent mental exhaustion, a gilded imprisonment where her own body, her clothes, and her schedule belonged entirely to the state, leaving her an absolute stranger to her own self. Chapter 12. The Treachery of the Waterways. When the heat of the capital became entirely unbearable, the royal court would migrate, traveling along the spine of Egypt via the Nile. While these royal barges were floating palaces of cedar and gold leaf, they introduced a terrifying new layer of physical danger. The Nile was not a gentle river. It was a wild, untamed ecosystem. As the Empress sat on her shaded deck, breathing in the thick, humid air of the marshlands, she was surrounded by lethal predators. The river was thick with massive Nile crocodiles and aggressive hippopotamuses, both of which regularly attacked smaller boats and could capsize even larger vessels if provoked. But the invisible dangers were far worse. The stagnant canals and river edges where the royal barge docked were breeding grounds for parasitic flatworms that caused schistosomiasis, a debilitating disease that burrowed through the skin of anyone who touched the river water, causing chronic organ damage and wasting illness. Furthermore, the swarms of mosquitoes rising from the papyrus reeds carried deadly strains of malaria. For the Empress, a simple evening breeze on the river deck meant exposing herself to agonizing fevers and microscopic killers that ancient medicine had absolutely no way to fight. Chapter 13. The Silent Language of Feathers. Because the Empress lived in a world where a sudden shift in political favor could mean literal death, her daily interactions were a masterful exercise in exhausting psychological defense. She had to navigate the language of Feathers' complex web of unspoken debts and hidden alliances. Every gift brought to her a necklace of lapis lazuli from a provincial governor, a rare monkey from a trader in Punt, or a jar of fine wine from a high priest was never just a gift. It was a calculated debt. If she accepted the present, she was subtly signaling her political backing to that faction. If she refused it, she risked making an immediate, powerful enemy who might fund a harrowing conspiracy against her children. She had to spend her evenings decoding the underlying threats behind every polite conversation. A courtier wishing her good health might actually be checking to see if her chronic lead poisoning was starting to show. A secondary wife offering a hand-woven tunic for the young prince might be testing the boundaries to see how close she could get to the heir. This constant, high-stakes paranoia turned every palace feast, every musical performance, and every casual walk through the columns into an exhausting mental chess game where a single misstep meant total ruin. Chapter 14. The Splendid Paralyzer. To look at the reliefs carved into the walls of Luxor and Karnak, the Empress appears entirely fluid, a graceful silhouette of pleated white linen and elegant postures. But this artistic convention hid a brutal physical reality. The daily attire of the great royal wife was designed to do one specific thing: restrict her physical autonomy so she could function only as a living monument. Her clothing was not made of loose, comfortable fabric. The finest royal linen was tightly spun, starch-pressed, and wrapped around her torso so snugly that it acted as a rigid binder to maintain the ultra-tight, form-fitting silhouette demanded by court style. She could take only short, measured, mincing steps. Sitting down required a deliberate, agonizingly slow process to avoid tearing the delicate, pristine fabric, and deep breaths were physically restricted by the tightness of the weave. But the true weight lay in the ornamentation. Suspended from her neck was the wisek, a massive, semicircular collar piece, made of row after row of solid gold beads, heavy carnelian, jasper, and lapis lazuli. This single piece of jewelry could weigh up to several kilograms. It pressed directly onto her collarbones and shoulder muscles for hours at a time, leaving deep, raw indentations in her skin and causing chronic, severe neck strain. Above this collar rested the royal wig. Because her head was shaved bare to protect against the rampant lice and intense heat of the Nile Valley, she wore a towering hairpiece made of human hair and sheep's wool. To keep its shape, the wig was saturated with heavy layers of animal fat and perfumed beeswax. In the 40-degree Egyptian heat, this heavy wax cone slowly melted down her scalp and forehead, trapping her body heat, creating a suffocating layer of sweat, and causing severe skin irritation and painful heat rashes. Finally, atop this heavy wig sat the ultimate symbol of her imprisonment, the neckbird vulture headdress, or the sweeping double plumes of a moon. Carved from beaten sheet gold and heavy gemstones, These crowns were intentionally unbalanced to prevent the towering headdress from toppling forward or sliding off. The Empress was forced to keep her neck perfectly rigid, her shoulders pinned back, and her chin held at an unnatural, unmoving tilt. She could not look down to see her own steps. She could not turn her head quickly to respond to a sudden noise, and she could not bend forward without risking a humiliating, blasphemous fall. Her clothing did not celebrate her power. It physically paralyzed her, trapping a living human being inside a heavy, suffocating, and painful golden tomb. Chapter 15. The Unrest of the Palace Night. Even when the heavy gold headdress was removed, the heavy linen unstitched, and the torches dimmed, the night brought no true physical relief or comfort to the Empress. The physical architecture of luxury in the ancient world carried its own hidden miseries. The grand stone walls of the palace, built to keep out the blinding heat of the daytime sun, acted as a massive thermal battery. As darkness fell over the Nile, the thick mud brick and limestone began to radiate all the intense heat they had absorbed throughout the 40-degree day. The air inside her private bedchamber grew stagnant, thick, and suffocatingly hot. But this moisture attracted the true tormentors of the Egyptian night. Endless clouds of mosquitoes rising from the nearby river banks and papyrus marshes. Because ancient Egypt had no window glass, the Empress slept beneath a canopy of heavy, coarse linen netting. The netting trapped her body heat inside, making the air underneath feel like a furnace, while the relentless buzzing of insects outside the fabric served as a constant reminder of the malaria and fevers that plagued the valley. When she lay her head down, it did not rest on a soft down pillow. To protect her complex, beeswax-styled hair and keep her neck elevated in the heat, she rested her neck on a wurst of rigid, curved headdress carved from solid alabaster, ivory, or wood. Sleeping required her to remain perfectly still on her back, her skull balanced on a hard stone crescent, listening to the pacing footsteps of armed guards outside her door and the shifting whispers of the harem. Even in sleep, the Empress could never truly let go of her royal posture, nor the deep, underlying survival instinct required to wake up alive the next morning. If you were to step out of the golden isolation of the royal palace and enter the sun-baked mud brick homes of ordinary citizens, you would find the true heart of Egypt's survival. Here, the rhythm of daily life was dictated not by court ritual, but by the fire, the clay oven, and the hands of Egyptian women. In the ancient world, women were the foundational cooks, the bakers, and the primary nutritionists of society, while the wealthy elite gorged on roasted ox and imported wines. Every ordinary Egyptian woman possessed an intimate, generational knowledge of the ingredients provided by the black soil of the Nile. They understood how to stretch simple staples into deeply nourishing, flavorful meals that kept the empire's massive workforce alive. At the absolute center of every woman's culinary world were two things: bread tar and beer henket. They were so fundamental that they served as the literal currency of Egypt. Workers were paid in loaves and jugs. Every morning began with the grueling physical labor of bread making. Women used a coarse grain called emmer wheat, which was notoriously difficult to process. They had to moisten the spikelets, pound them with heavy pestles to remove the hulls, and then kneel over a flat stone slab a saddle quern, rubbing a smaller stone back and forth for hours to grind the grain into flour. Because these grinding stones slowly shed tiny particles, the flour was always slightly gritty with fine sand. The dough was shaped into round loaves, cones, or triangles and baked in heavy, PI-heated clay pots over open fires. Right alongside the baking was the brewing. Ancient Egyptian beer wasn't like modern beer. It was thick, cloudy, and highly nutritious, resembling a rich green porridge. Women brewed it by lightly baking loaves of barley bread, breaking them into water, and letting the wild yeasts ferment the mixture in large ceramic vats. It was low in alcohol, but packed with essential B vitamins and protein, making it the safe, clean hydration source that every mother fed to her children, her husband, and herself daily. Because red meat was a rare luxury reserved only for major religious festivals, the women of Egypt relied heavily on plant-based proteins. Their kitchens were filled with sacks of dried legumes, lentils, chickpeas, and fava beans, which could be stored for months without spoiling. The daily main meal, eaten in the cool of the evening, was almost always a thick, slow-simmered stew. Women would throw fava beans into a clay pot over the embers, mashing them into a dense, savory puree known as bisara, flavored with wild herbs. But the true soul of Egyptian cooking lay in two humble bulbs, onions and garlic. Every woman knew these weren't just food, they were medicine. Onions were eaten raw by the handful with bread, valued for their crisp sweetness and their ability to prevent heat sickness. Garlic was crushed into stews to ward off stomach parasites and infections. To add depth to their broths, women gathered wild green scallions, leeks, and crisp romaine lettuce, which grew in abundance along the irrigation canals, the gifts of the river and the marsh. When a family needed fresh protein, they turned their eyes toward the Nile and the thick papyrus marshes of the delta. Fishing was a common necessity, and women knew exactly how to handle it. The river provided an endless supply of tilapia, catfish, and perch. Because the intense Egyptian heat would rot fresh fish within hours, women mastered the art of preservation. They would split the fish open, clean them, pack them heavily with coarse desert salt, and lay them out on flat mud brick roofs to dry in the blazing sun. This pungent, salted fish could last for weeks and was a favorite savory treat to pair with fresh bread. From the sky, waterfowl provided a welcome feast. Common families kept small flocks of geese and ducks. Women would roast them on wooden spits over open flames, letting the rich fat drip down to flavor their bean pots, or boil them into thick, comforting poultry broth seasoned with coriander, cumin, and dried dill. The natural confections. Without access to sugar cane or refined sugars, satisfying a sweet tooth required an intimate knowledge of the orchard trees. For the average woman, the most precious sweeteners were dates and figs. Towering date palms grew in every village and oasis. Women harvested the heavy clusters, eating them plump and fresh in the summer, or compressing them into thick, sticky bricks to dry. These dried dates could be boiled down into a rich, dark syrup or date honey that women used to sweeten festive cakes. They also gathered the sycamore fig, a fruit so deeply tied to nourishment that the tree was worshipped as the living body of the goddess Hathor. For a truly special treat, women would grind up tiger nuts, the sweet, tuberous roots of a marsh sedge, and knead them together with wild honey and a bit of animal fat to form small, sweet, conical pastries. As the family gathered on woven reed mats on the dirt floor of their home, sharing a bowl of sweet figs and breaking a loaf of sandy emmer bread, They were participating in a culinary tradition that would remain virtually unchanged for thousands of years. As the Egyptian family gathered on their woven reed mats, sharing a bowl of sweet figs and breaking a loaf of sandy emmer bread, they were participating in a culinary tradition that kept an entire empire alive. For thousands of years, it was the humble grains of the earth, not the luxury of kings, that fueled the ancient world. And if we travel across the Mediterranean Sea, moving forward in time to the height of the Roman Empire, we find that this reliance on simple, plant-based food held true even for the most violent spectacles in human history. Let the warm winds of the Nile fade away now. In their place, hear the distant, echoing roar of the Colosseum, and the heavy thud of wooden training swords hitting the sand. Let us step inside the training camps of Rome to look at a very different kind of diet and the myth of the meat-eating warrior. Chapter 1. The Barley Men of Rome. If our modern imagination paints a Roman gladiator as a lean, hyper-muscled warrior fueled by heavy portions of roasted meat, the historical reality is completely different. The most feared fighters of the Roman Empire were actually known by a very specific nickname in the streets of Rome, the Hordeari or the Barley Men. To understand why these elite athletes lived on a diet that modern bodybuilders might find shocking, we have to look directly at the scientific evidence left behind in the soil of the ancient world. In 1993, archaeologists uncovered a massive 2nd century mass grave in the ancient city of Ephesus, located in modern-day Turkey. It contained the skeletal remains of over 60 individuals, systematically identified as gladiators due to their traumatic combat injuries and their proximity to the city's grand arena. Anthropologists took these ancient bones into the lab and performed a highly precise technique called stable isotope ratio analysis. Chapter 2. The isotope evidence. By vaporizing tiny fragments of the gladiator's bone collagen and measuring the ratios of elements like carbon, nitrogen, and strontium, scientists could reconstruct exactly what these fighters had been eating during the final years of their lives. What the bones revealed, the nitrogen levels in the gladiator bones were remarkably low, while the carbon levels matched a highly specific profile. If these men had been eating a high-protein diet rich in beef, poultry, or river fish, their nitrogen levels would have been drastically higher. Instead, the chemical signatures proved that the elite fighters of the arena were strict, functional vegetarians. Their daily fuel consisted almost entirely of two things: coarse barley and fava beans. This massive dose of complex carbohydrates was served daily in the Ludus, the training school, as a thick, heavy porridge. It was a cheap, highly efficient way for the Lanista, the gladiator owner, to keep hundreds of fighters energized through grueling, 10-hour daily training regimens without spending a fortune on expensive meats. Chapter 3. The strategy of the fat layer. This high-carb, plant-based diet wasn't just a cost-cutting measure. It was a deliberate biological strategy designed to keep the gladiators alive inside the arena. Eating massive quantities of barley and beans caused the gladiators to pack on a thick, dense layer of subcutaneous fat right beneath their skin. In the brutal world of public spectacle, this fat acted as a literal biological shield. When a gladiator was struck by a sweeping gladius or a trident, the weapon would slice through this thick layer of surface fat, rather than penetrating deeper to sever critical muscle tissue, major arteries, or exposed nerves. A fat fighter could sustain a gruesome, deeply bloody laceration that thrilled the thousands of shouting spectators in the Colosseum crowds, yet keep fighting with no loss of functional mobility. The fat layer allowed the arena to deliver exactly what the Roman populace demanded: a high-stakes, incredibly bloody show while protecting the manager's highly valuable, heavily trained financial investments from dying too quickly. Chapter 4. The Ancient Energy Drink. Because a pure grain diet lacked the diverse micronutrients needed to heal fractured bones and deeply torn muscles after an intense match, the gladiators relied on a highly unique, bitter supplement recorded by the Roman historian Pliny the Elder. Immediately following a training session or a public fight, the warriors were forced to drink a foul-tasting concoction made by mixing charred plant ash or crushed bone ash directly into a cup of vinegar and water. For centuries, modern historians viewed this text as a strange myth, but when the lab teams analyzed the strontium to calcium ratios in the Ephesus bones, they found that the gladiators possessed extraordinarily high mineral densities, far higher than the average Roman citizen buried in the same region. The ash drink was a highly effective, ancient form of an electrolyte and calcium supplement. It rapidly rebuilt their bone matrix, fortified their skeletal structure against heavy impacts, and helped prevent the debilitating muscle cramps that could spell immediate death in the middle of the sand, giving them the physical resilience required to face a violent, unpredictable fate on the sand. Both the gladiators of Rome and the common people of the ancient world lived on a knife's edge, where survival was a daily, physical negotiation. But while Rome's fighters were locked in an arena for public entertainment, further north, an entire society relied on every single member of its community just to survive the harsh winters and hostile raids of the Baltic. Let the echoing roars of the Colosseum fade into the quiet expanse of the northern wilderness. Let us open a new chapter in our journey tonight, looking past the myths of Viking raiders to find the real, flesh and blood women who held the keys to the longhouse and sometimes the weapons of war. For generations, the Shieldmaiden was viewed by modern historians as nothing more than a poetic device found in Norse mythology, a romanticized character inhabiting the Icelandic sagas alongside dragons and valkyries. Writers like Saxo Grammaticus described bands of fierce women who put away the softness of women and fought alongside men. But for decades, these accounts were dismissed by the academic world as mere folklore, written down centuries after the Viking Age had ended. The prevailing assumption was simple: the violent, expansionist world of the Norsemen belonged exclusively to men. Women stayed behind to tend the longhouses, manage the farms, and raise the next generation of raiders. However, the dirt beneath Scandinavia held secrets that would completely upend our understanding of Norse society, turning myth into hard, unyielding archaeological fact. The turning point came from a high-status grave originally excavated in the late 19th century in the Viking trading town of Berka, Sweden. Catalogued as BJ 581, this burial was long celebrated as the ultimate archetype of a legendary male Viking warrior. The occupant was buried with an arsenal of destruction: a heavy iron sword, an axe, a fighting knife, 2 spears, 2 shields, and 25 armor-piercing arrows. At the foot of the grave lay the skeletons of 2 slaughtered horses, one bridled for riding, signaling a commander of elite cavalry. For over a century, no one questioned the warrior's gender. But in 2017, a team of Swedish geneticists extracted genomic DNA from the skeleton's arm bone and tooth root. The results sent shockwaves through the historical community. The individual carried two X chromosomes and no Y chromosome. This elite military commander, buried with the full honors of a high-ranking officer, was biologically female. Osteological analysis further confirmed her physical traits. She was roughly 170 centimeters tall, in her late 20s, and possessed muscle attachment marks on her bones consistent with extensive, lifelong horse riding and physical training. To understand what a female warrior actually did, we must look at the brutal daily physical reality of Norse martial arts. Combat in the Viking Age was an exhausting display of stamina and mechanical force. A woman choosing the path of a warrior did not fight differently than a man. She wielded the same heavy iron tools. Her training began in childhood, learning how to balance her weight behind a heavy round shield made of solid pine or fir. The Viking shield was not a passive barrier. It was an active weapon used to punch opponents, trap their blades, and bash their faces in the tight, suffocating confines of a shield wall. To effectively swing a 1.2 kilogram iron sword or a heavy bearded axe for hours in battle required immense upper body strength and rotational core power. This strength was built through the manual labor of everyday Norse life splitting firewood, rowing heavy wooden longships against North Sea currents, and handling large livestock supplemented by wrestling matches and weapon drills. When she stood in the front lines of a raid or defense, she was locked shoulder to shoulder with her male counterparts, pushing against an oncoming enemy wall, breathing in the stench of mud and blood, and relying entirely on her physical conditioning to avoid a fatal split-second mistake. The societal role of a female warrior was highly complex, bound by the rigid, law-guided nature of Norse communities. In Viking culture, women already possessed a level of legal autonomy that was virtually unheard of in the rest of Christian Europe. They could own property, initiate divorces, and reclaim their dowries. When the men left for summer raids across England, France, or the Baltic, the women were left in complete, absolute control of the homestead. A female warrior, or a woman capable of martial defense, occupied a dual position of high respect. She was the Aegis-Freyja, the mistress of the house, symbolized by the heavy iron keys she wore hooked to her tunic brooches. But she was also a strategic defender. If a rival clan or foreign raiders struck a village while the main fleet was away, she was responsible for organizing the immediate defense. She had to don her woolen kirtle and riveted iron mail, rally the remaining youths and elders, and command the defenses of the estate. Her martial skill was a practical necessity to protect the generational wealth, the grain stores, and the survival of her bloodline from being wiped out in a single afternoon. But the path of the warrior left permanent, visible scars. Recent examinations of other female remains across Scandinavia and the British Isles have revealed the grim physical cost of this lifestyle. At a Viking cemetery in Seoul, Norway, a female skeleton was found buried in a rich cache of weapons. When forensic anthropologists examined her skull, they discovered a deep, severe gash across her forehead. The bone showed clear signs of remodeling and healing, proving that she had survived a violent, close-quarters blow from a sword or axe, only to live on and continue her military duties. Other female skeletons show the wear and tear of a life of intense physical strain, severe osteoarthritis in the lower spine from carrying heavy chainmail, microfractures in the wrists from absorbing the immense shock of weapons hitting her shield. and deep muscular developments in the shoulders from thousands of hours spent rowing longships across open oceans. These women were not decorative icons or mythical protectors. They were flesh and blood veterans who bled, suffered from chronic physical pain, and bore the heavy, permanent structural marks of a lifetime spent surviving by the edge of an iron blade. Take a deep, slow breath. Let the grand, candlelit galleries of Tudor England fade away into the shadows. Let the heavy scent of lavender, the pale powders, and the golden ornaments of the past dissolve entirely into the dark. Tonight, we have traveled far across the deep currents of time. We have stood in the cool, silent limestone corridors of the Pharaohs. We have felt the cold, biting winds of the northern shield walls, and walked the sandy training grounds of Rome's arena fighters. Let your mind grow heavy. Let your muscles release all their remaining tension, sinking deeply into the comfort of your bed. You have traveled a long way tonight, and now it is time to rest. The world is sleeping, and you can sleep too. Sleep now and rest. Good night.